Well, it's cherry harvesting season, and that's a great opportunity to talk about a plant's life cycle. What do I mean by life cycle? Well, really it's the question of how does an individual little seed inside of a cherry like this turn into a whole new cherry tree? Well, that has to do with the plant's life cycle, or the stages in its life. And it's really important that certain conditions are met at every one of those stages. So let's, for instance, start with a cherry. Inside the cherry, hiding in there, of course, is a cherry seed. Now, or otherwise known as a cherry pit. If this cherry seed falls into nutrient-rich, warm, moist soil, it has the potential to germinate. That is, sprout into a new cherry plant. And it's really critical that happens at the right time, because, for instance, right now we're in the fall, and if a new cherry tree were to sprout, that would be bad, because it would be starting to grow right when it was starting to get cold. So actual cherry seeds do not germinate unless they are exposed to cold. This prevents them from sprouting in the fall. They will sprout after they've been exposed to cold in the spring. So if we assume that the cherry tree seed is successful and germinates, we will end up with the second stage in the life cycle called a seedling. And a seedling is just a small version of the cherry tree. That's when it's at its most sensitive, though, because that cherry seedling, that small plant, has to compete with other plants. There has to get enough sunlight, and there has to be enough warmth so that it doesn't freeze. Now, if it survives, we move on to the next stage in the life cycle, and that is a full-fledged new cherry tree. So, if the cherry tree survives to maturity, it then is time for it to continue the cycle and reproduce. And that leads us to one of the more beautiful stages in the cherry tree life cycle, and that is flowering. Because when a cherry tree flowers, it's a wonderful, colorful spectacle. And those flowers are have the male and female parts that allow a cherry trees to exchange genetic information. Now, the critical part that's necessary for that are pollinators, because bees transfer pollen between flowers. Now, for instance, if a cherry tree flowers when it's too cold, there won't be any bees flying for pollination to take place. That means there will be no cherries that year. So, if we assume, though, that the cherry tree flowers when it's warm, pollinators will exchange the pollen from flower to flower, and we will end up with fruit. And that, of course, leads us back to the beginning of the cycle with our cherries. And of course, in our cherry, we have our seeds. Now, the only thing that's left is that these seeds have to be dispersed. So that means maybe someone like me eating them and throwing the seeds someplace else in nice, nutritious soil. And that brings us back, of course, to the seed and germination. So that's a plant's life cycle. It's a continuous loop, really a circle of life for the plant.